When you look up the term lost media on the internet, Wikipedia describes that lost media is an umbrella term describing examples of media that are non-existent, missing, or unavailable to the general public. The term primarily encompasses visual, audio, or audio-visual media such as films, television and radio broadcasts, music, and video games. Which brings me to today's video. It seems like almost any popular franchise has a rich history in this subject, and Mortal Kombat is no exception. I mean, the game's been around for 30 years, and whether it was film, TV, or the video games, there's a bunch of stuff out there that comes under this lost media description. Now, in the specific case of video games, I wanted to gather together some examples of popular Mortal Kombat products that either never saw the light of day, were discontinued, or simply just a part of history now, where all that's left is to tell the story. Now, as the title suggests, there isn't going to be a lot of footage of this stuff in the video, besides maybe a few renders or screenshots or something, because it's all documented in various forums, old articles, and more. But across almost every generation, there is Mortal Kombat material that once was, but is no longer. And stuff that I would absolutely love nothing more than to see in action, but sadly, that time has definitely passed. Welcome to today's video, where I break down some various forms of lost Mortal Kombat media. Starting off with something a bit more modern, as strange as that sounds, as the game is already 8 years old at this point, is Mortal Kombat X. Mortal Kombat X remains a really popular fighting game amongst fans, and with a healthy online player base and fantastic netcode, you can still jump in to this day and have some fun matches, whether it's casual play or tournament. However, did you know that originally MKX was supposed to release on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, as well as the more modern systems at the time like the Xbox One and PlayStation 4? You wouldn't really have noticed this if you go back and watch the trailers and stuff, because those videos often ended with a 2015 date and with no logos at the bottom, except for WB and NRS, of course. This may sound strange now, but remember that for popular games, especially in that time frame, it was kind of common for games to come out on both the latest systems and the previous console. Many games on the 360 and PS3 still had good player bases, so it was a market to sell to, right? Not everybody had a next-gen console at that time. The story of the previous generation versions of the game is a relatively simple and common one. It was set to release on those consoles, being handled by High Voltage Software, who were also responsible for the original PC version of MKX, but also the PC versions of MK9 and Injustice Gods Among Us. Now, once MKX released in April of 2015 on the main systems, word of the 360 and PS3 ports would go relatively silent. The ports had already been delayed at this point to a vague summer of 2015 release, with a less official delay taking place in May, as an autumn listing had appeared online in various places. Finally, in August of 2015, the official word was out, and these ports would be declared as cancelled, in a statement that read, "After months of development, Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment has come to the regrettable conclusion that we cannot release Mortal Kombat X for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Please know our teams worked diligently to meet the quality standards set by the current-gen versions of the game. We were not able to get the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions to the quality expected of a Mortal Kombat game, and are very sorry for not being able to deliver the products as originally planned." This marked the end of the story. I think everybody in the community was unsure over how MKX would even run properly on those consoles without needing significant downgrades in performance and visuals. And looking back, it did seem for the best, because with just how much the game would have had to be downgraded just to run properly, I don't think the experience would have been worth it for anybody. Now, there's tons of ways to play MKX, but once upon a time, there would have been two more. I guess finally there was supposedly footage of the 360 version in action on various forums, but the community had debunked it as fake pretty quickly. So as far as MKX and its unreleased versions go, that's that. If you look hard enough on the internet, you can find various bits and bobs that suggest that maybe Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe would have had a few differences once upon a time. Now, game files and names do not always give the full story, and whenever people find these, sometimes it's a placeholder and sometimes it is just there. But there's a few things in the case of MK vs. DC that are at least interesting to look into these days. It was discovered that there is some unused character data, some of which even naming characters like Brainiac, who wasn't in the game at all, but could be seen in various file names for characters like The Flash. Now what this could have meant, who knows? It is just a file name, and we'd see Brainiac in the flesh with the release of Injustice 2 anyway. There's a few other things in there, like an unused announcer line for Dark Khan, the fusion of Darkseid and Shao Kahn, who serves as the game's final boss. Dark Khan having a player 2 color palette, so perhaps one day he was meant to be playable. This is all rather common stuff though, where just because it was potentially an idea once upon a time, doesn't mean that it stays that way. And often, leftover files are kind of just kicking around. Another more standout character in the files though is Quan Chi. This is important because it was stated that DLC was an original plan for MK vs. DC, which would be new fighters, arenas and such. It has been stated in the past that the first two characters that would have appeared here were Quan Chi from Mortal Kombat and Harley Quinn from DC Universe. The big issue being that Midway would disband as a company due to various reasons, bringing whatever DLC plans existed for this game to a complete stop. It's been said online that Quan Chi and Harley were pretty much finished by the time all of this unfortunate business rolled around. Creation of characters is one thing, but if things are in place that prevent them being added to the public version of the game, there really isn't much you can do. And I still, to this day, feel so bad for the team because all that work so close to being released and stopped by powers out of their control at the last hurdle, it just hurts to think about. I will be forever curious to see what their playstyles would have been like. We even had an official render of Quan Chi before the plans ended, which is almost identical to his MK9 look, so that's cool. But from a gameplay perspective, what would their moves have been? Was anything that went unused in MK vs. DC kept in there for MK9 perhaps? Stuff like Quan Chi's skeletal boost, which really didn't work so good in MK9. Perhaps that would have been a bit stronger and useful in MKDC if it was there originally, right? There are so many questions, but all we can do now is look back and imagine what could have been. And even then, this was before the time of complete editions that contain all DLC on disc, so would it even be a nightmare trying to acquire DLC characters for this game nowadays? I mean, like, in an alternate timeline, would this video be saying stuff like, yeah, MKDC had DLC, but it's such an old game now that you can't obtain them, and all we have is old VODs to look back on? What a bizarre situation that would have been. A topic that I have actually recently covered on this channel, but more than deserving of a spot on this list, is the abandoned version of Mortal Kombat Special Forces. For those not in the know, MK Special Forces was one of the spin-off games in the franchise that wasn't a fighting game. This one was a beat-em-up, and it focused on Jax taking down the Black Dragon, with Kano as the game's main antagonist. The game we ended up with was nowhere near the game originally planned, and if you want a more in-depth dive into this subject, I can link the video in the description for you, but in general, here's the rundown in hopefully a faster format. Development troubles and key members of the team leaving the project and company meant that many old ideas and features would stay on the drawing board, resulting in a majorly stripped down and fairly generic PS1 beat-em-up. It's not exactly the worst game ever made, but it's nothing special either. The tragic thing is, this game was supposed to be so much more, and what you're watching here is the E3 prototype version from 1999. This includes a lot of what the game was supposed to have originally. A long time ago, when the game was well underway in its development, John Tobias could be seen in an IGN interview talking about the controls, the mobility, the kind of platforming a player could pull off. Games like Tomb Raider were a huge inspiration towards the controls, and it is so clear when you play the prototype version that this is the case. The game would feature in-game cutscenes with a lot more voice acting, characters having a lot more identity to their role in the story, the hatred Sonya feels for Kano, and the guilt that she no doubt feels for her lost teammates after the Black Dragon ambushed them. Not to mention an originally planned story involving links to Shao Kahn, Raiden and other unnamed MK characters making an appearance. There was supposed to be a lot more than what we ended up with. The prototype gives us a lot more direction here, with even an unscarred Cabal disagreeing with Kano over the nuclear weapon that the Black Dragon stole in this story. There's a lot more to this, as John Tobias confirmed in a Twitter thread a few years ago. But it's definitely a bittersweet feeling to experience a mere taste of what the game could have been, versus the end product we had with way more limited movement, none of the platforming, a static camera. We were left with a shell of what Special Forces was supposed to actually be. Not to mention that the game was supposed to launch for both the N64 and Sony PlayStation, but eventually the N64 version was axed, leaving just the PlayStation as the only system to play it on. Like I said, if you want to know more about the story behind this game and the small details that I've no doubt missed here, please check out the Special Forces video that I made a few months ago. It goes into a lot more detail. But ultimately, this one E3 demo is the closest thing we'll ever get to seeing what Special Forces was meant to be. And finally today, something I consider to be my personal holy grail of lost media. Something that briefly existed in the public domain but would seemingly vanish off the face of the earth, where all that's left are forum posts from those that were able to play at the time. I am talking about Mortal Kombat 3, the Wavenet Edition. Your first question is probably, what on earth is Wavenet? I'm not completely sure of the exact details myself, and this is one of those subjects that is entirely based on what you can find online. However, I will do my best. The Wavenet version was a special network version of the game that was focused on connecting players online. Players had the choice to play standard offline, just like the original game, but there was also a choice to connect to an online opponent. Standard stuff like entering a name and finding whoever it is you're going to play, where from that point you could fight against somebody over the internet. The story goes, and what can be seen from players at the time, is that it began as regular Mortal Kombat 3. It would eventually be upgraded to Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. And then, and this is the big one, would receive a new version of the game, technically granting Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 its final revision, unseen by anybody that had never played on a Wavenet machine before, which is most people. This version was said to have a decent amount of changes to the gameplay itself, but because we have no footage of it, it entirely has to come down from the word of those that were around in the specific locations. Some of those changes included Striker's Gun Infinite being interrupted with an in-game message, Cabal's Nomad Dash had slower startup and it made some kind of loud noise on activation. Even Kung Lao could only perform spin mid-combo a limited number of times. Basically, they did what they could to address the infinites, and even nerfed the best character in the game with a slower Nomad Dash. A slower dash, in theory, was a pretty big change, considering the utility that it gave Cabal in the first place. But balance wasn't the only thing that the Wavenet version had tried to change around. Due to a good chunk of statements on forums from many years ago, this game was the only arcade version of Ultimate MK3 to have Noob Saibot as an official playable character, with a teleport slam being listed as a special move and a selection of dialer combos. Although some reports said you needed a combat code to play as him, some say it was kind of just like playing Human Smoke, but you had to hover over Kano first. Either way, Noob Saibot playable here was a pretty monumental thing for fans of the character, right? So, why didn't this kick off, and why do so many people still have no idea about it? Well, it was only location tested in Chicago and San Francisco. In terms of internet, it supposedly used a pretty expensive line that connected directly to Midway's Chicago headquarters. With an extremely limited location test and the, I suppose, infancy of internet gaming, especially with something like this, I guess it all must have contributed in some way to things being discontinued. I absolutely do not want to say anything for certainty, because the information on this build of the game, and even the existence of Wavenet in general, is so hard to come by and so difficult to find anything concrete on, that it's impossible to dedicate to any kind of opinion. We just know that once upon a time, there was an exclusive version of Ultimate MK3 with online capability and version-specific changes and features. Possibly the only time we've ever seen promotional footage involving this thing was that for a split second in a Making of MK Mythologies video, while John Tobias is showing the audience around their little arcade setup, you can see a Wavenet machine with Ultimate MK3 in the shot. But that is genuinely all I've ever seen of this thing. If we're talking lost media in Mortal Kombat, this is the absolute finest example, because holy crap, it is one giant mystery. Hopefully today's video was an interesting one, and I've honestly loved making it. I've had so many of these games stuck in my head for so many years that I've loved putting it into words and maybe finally sharing these curiosities with all of you. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate your time as always, and I will see you next time. Take care.